say there are things in the image that you can use to map, which I don't know if that makes sense exactly, but I mean, I've posted some of these things.
Yeah.
Like I think relationships between objects in the image, where they are relative to each other within a painting, could possibly be where they are relative to each other on a map, for example. And so I'll try to use that to say, like, okay, like for the example, the Boston Pops, right? That's they play at the symphony hall. And so I look at that and where is it relative to the jewel and lining it up with some other things, which I posted just the other day. I put out my one video that kind of explains everything. But yeah, I just, I think there are ways to map to the important places like in the puzzle. And
Okay.
they're self-confirming in my opinion. Like once you do it and you see where you end up, you're like, oh, that makes sense because the Old North Church is in the verse.
Okay. I think I understand.
Like I said, I mean, I'll try to link the video before, but that I've made. It's been up for a while now. I'm sure a lot of people have checked it out. Not everyone might agree with it, but I mean, I feel pretty confident that that's something that they were trying to do. And so
Yeah.
I've used some of those mapping techniques and some of the other puzzles, and that's kind of why I feel like I have all the parks in the right spot. Um, but pinpointing it is obviously pretty difficult. I can attest to that. I dug in San Francisco and came up empty. So
Did you do you, well, I guess if you're are you like when you dug in San Francisco, did that take the park away from you, or do you just like I'm, a foot off, or I just don't know?
I mean, I still think I'm in the right spot, like the right
Okay.
location, but there's I mean, the end of the San Francisco verse is vague, man. Like what does giant pole and giant step really mean?
Yeah.
And there's different, you look in a dictionary, you look up some of these words, what they could mean, and with some of the things that I found like at that location, and there's multiple meanings for the word that could fit. And so I just went with what I thought was the best based on some image matches that I had, based on what the verse said, and I made my best logical guess, and it was wrong.
Yeah.
So, and actually, I dug two holes. So, um,
They're pretty good
I mean,
about
I
letting
don't.
you do that.
Yeah, I mean, he was cool. I kind of pushed the envelope a little bit on that, but whatever. Little slap on the wrist, no big deal. But regardless, like I ruled out two spots. So
Yeah. So, I mean, you were talking about the last part of the San Francisco image being vague, and I guess from my perspective, it's only vague because we don't understand it yet. Like in Boston, "Feel at home"
sure.
is the vaguest line I've ever heard. But when we understand it, we're like, oh yeah, okay, that's dumb. Um, what? So you were, just for full disclosure, I sent you the back of the book manuscript a couple of weeks before everybody else had it, right?
Right.
And you were able to tear through it. Is there anything in there? Is there anything in the manuscript that sort of changed your mind about the way you were applying any of the clues you found from the back of the book? Does that make sense?
No, yeah, it does. I don't think so. It's it's raised some interesting questions for me because like you have to think about it like is if there was something in there in the rough draft that they then took out. Okay, why did they take that out? Because I'm like on all these things, whether it's the manuscript or the actual book itself, like I'm constantly asking why. Why did they do it like this?
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the reason why I kind of think there's things in the book, like all throughout the book, the front, the back, everything.
Yeah.
So I'm always asking why. So that was one of the first questions, like, because I went through every single page and compared everything to the what's in the book. And a lot of it's just like, rough draft cleanup, right? Just editing so that you're just making it sound a little cleaner. Nothing really major, just some typical editing stuff. But then there's other things where it's like they obviously had an idea here because they're using a very specific reference. And then that reference was removed. And why did they remove it? Was it because in my mind, I look at everything as like, okay, that's like a specific reference that you could research and figure something out from. So did they remove it because it didn't fit with whatever they were trying to convey? Or what did they have something better? and I just kind of look at the comparison. Okay, they took this out and then they added this in. Why? And so is it more important to kind of focus on what was removed, or is it more important to focus on what's not there in the first draft that was then added later to go into the book? Because to me, that speaks a lot about kind of where they were at their mindset when they were
Yeah.
writing this thing. And like I said, I always go back to why. Why did they include this? Why was this reference so important that they had to have it in the book?
Well, doesn't that essentially make your job as a solver using the back of the book immensely more difficult? Right? Like if we take the fact knowing when the casks were made and knowing that this was written before the casks were made, then we think to ourselves, okay, Byron went to bury the casks after the back of the book was created. If there were clues in the back of the book pointing to a specific location, then maybe for some reason Byron couldn't bury it there. He had to switch locations. So they had to change shit in the back of the book. So now you're looking at edits in the back of the book for a location that's no longer valid, right?
Sure.
Or I mean, there's once you create that option, it just makes things so much more difficult for you.
Well, I mean, I kind of research everything anyways. Like as I read through any of the fairies, if it's just like your window dressing type text that's not really saying anything that you can, it's just random stuff, right? Just your typical Mad Magazine stuff. Like
Right.
I'm not even worrying about that. But when you get to a specific reference that you can actually look up and try to understand, like, okay, what's the context of this reference? Because I mean, unless you were there in 82, like you might not get it fully. Like
Mhm.
what are they getting at here? It might be a reference from the 70s that at that time might have still been kind of in the public thought of pop culture, that kind of stuff, but now it's long gone, so you don't really get it. I just research all that stuff and just try to get an idea of what it was like then and what that could have meant. But I mean, I don't know. I kind of feel like I came on right when you were talking about the how we use the back of the book.
Mhm.
So maybe I'll ask you a question like,
Sure.
so why do you think they would include references to things that don't seem to be anything um like why use a play on words for something that's actually like a piece of music or a book or a movie? Does that make
Can you,
sense? Like why put that in there?
can you give me an example?
Oh, there's lots of them. Like, for example, in the Scrububus, right? You look at the picture of her
Uh-huh.
come popping out of the washing machine. It mentions she's mother's little helper. Well, I mean, it's capitalized, right? So I looked that up, and that's a Rolling Stone song. Okay, and so
But it's
mother's
also it's a laundry detergent jingle. It's a laundry detergent jingle from the 80s or from the 70s. Oh god, what detergent is it? It's
well, it might be.
mommy's little
There's a bunch of
helper.
them. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a bunch of them listed in the actual text, right? So it could be one of those.
Yeah.
But then also it's like, oh wow, that's like a Rolling Stone song. And what's it about? It's about tranquilizers. And so when I see things like that, I just file it away. And I just happen to be at Tranquility Park, so I'm looking at things like that, like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Um, then when you find like two or three other references in the back of the book that all refer to tranquilizers, that's when like you mentioned before, like, is there a pattern back there? I start looking for patterns like that, like repeat usage of things,
Yeah.
repeat uses of ideas, concepts, things like that to kind of solidify, like, okay, maybe this is what they were trying to get us to pay attention to.
I mean that kind of makes sense because it's basically what people are doing with the front of the book now too. Like Chris and John's thing where they take the month and the gem and all of this, and they create the patterns that give them the park. So like in San Francisco, they say the painting and the verse is mainly about things coming together and unity and yin yang, and that ends up in
Sure.
Union Square. It's a pattern of themes that ends up in one spot. So you're basically using it the same way.
Yeah, and I'll say right now, like that theme that they talked about, I totally agree with. I'm just at a different spot. So, I mean, everybody has their interpretation of what it actually means, right?
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, I'm coughing.
It's all good.
Yeah. I mean, we're all at different spots, so it's fine. One of
And
us will be right.
that's kind of how I feel. I mean, everybody's using the verse and the image and coming to different spots. Well, if you're trying to use the back of the book, like you're going to come to a different spot just the same way, right? Like I don't see it as really anything different. There's just a lot more information there that you're going to have to sift through and try to understand what they were trying to get you to think. And that's kind of what I feel like it is. Like I'll explain it this way. Who wrote the book?
Which part?
Just anybody.
I,
Who
I
wrote what
mean,
section?
so it Byron obviously wrote the front. Sean
Sure.
and Ted wrote the back.
Sure. Now, who really wrote the book?
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, this is a book that's a mythology, right? Like who really wrote the book? Who gave them the information?
I guess the counter argument to that is, did they have to be given information?
Well, I mean, if you're thinking of it like if you're not willing to suspend your disbelief, right? Like when you go to a movie, right? You have to suspend your disbelief or else you're just not going to enjoy the movie.
Yeah.
You have to suspend your disbelief here because it's essentially a story about fairies that are giving you their story via these guys that wrote the book.
Okay.
And that was verified in one of the old newspaper articles by Byron.
Yeah.
Like he went into a whole thing with this one reporter about how serious he was that the fairies trusted him and just everything about it spoke to that they were the mediators between the fairies and man, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, if you want to, and it's a mythology for the modern world, so if you want to really get into the mythology of the book, you have to accept that the fairies gave them the stories and
Okay.
all they are doing is reporting what the fairies have told them.
Okay.
And so when I get to things like people will tell me, well, Byron would never lie. Well, there's one of two ways you could look at it that could justify why the back would be important. The first would be he's keeping the secret. The fairies told him he's not going to give up the goods because he's promised them that he's not. That would be one way. The
Okay.
other way would be they never told him. They hid it within the information that they gave him to write the book. And for him to say something like to Brian Zinn, right, where he goes, the back of the book has nothing to do with the treasure hunt. I would totally agree with that. It doesn't have anything to do with it. It's not going to answer any of the clues in the verse. It's not going to answer any of the clues really in the images. It's going to be things that in some way are similar to where you end up if you were to get the answer right. And so that's kind of how I look at things. Like I'm in certain places, and when I look at stuff in the back, I'm just seeing where do I end up and trying to put myself in the right headspace so that I can think, how does this relate to this puzzle that it's trying to get me to think about? That's kind of
So
how I use it.
my problems with the back of the book, like back in the day when we did the first 12 podcasts, even going to last year, right before the manuscript came out, um, I was I was hoping that someone would give me something from the back of the book that I would latch onto, because it's a whole section of this book that I love that I don't pay any attention to, right? And I would love to pay more attention to it. But given what we know about how it was made, and especially in the manuscript, right? Like you were asking who wrote the book. It's plausible and very likely that Sean and Ted were writing a parody of another book, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And it was all done prior to this, prior to the treasure hunt. It's highly possible that Byron wanted to get it packaged with the treasure hunt and wrote the fairies because he had a text full of fairies. And
Sure.
like we know, like if we look at what is it, Handy Mandy Core, right?
Hmm.
Handy Mandy Core in the manuscript isn't even named Handy. In fact, there's a lot of fairies in the manuscript that aren't named what they're named in the book. They were like, the text is the same for the
Most of it.
for the most part. There's a lot
Yeah.
of cleaning up. There's a couple of little changes, but like they're named completely different things. It's pretty obvious it was written. I mean, we know it was written prior to the treasures being buried because of the dates of everything. Like I just don't see how now, given the facts, I can't make the leap in my head to tie it into being relevant, which sucks. Like I said, because I really want it to be relevant. I really want there to be something back there. I could see, because there's a lot of fairies that are in the back of the book that aren't in this manuscript, right? There's a
Right.
lot that
Yeah.
aren't in any lists. I could see them being relevant though, because they would have obviously been written after the treasure.
Yeah. We know from that one article, they talked about how many fairies he wanted, and he wanted one for each state, and they ended up with 76. So you know that they had less than 50 at that point.
Yeah.
Was the page that interested me the most was 93.
Hang on, I'll see if I can pull it up.
That was the update that was actually sent to Sean and Ted, and it has a date on it. That was the out of
The eight
all the
sixteen 81.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like midsummer of 81, and here are the fairies that we got, right? And there's like, it numbers them down to like 50.
Yeah. And
And
then
then over
there's,
on the right, it's like 30 unassigned, right? And
yeah.
it wants like, okay, we want 6 good fairies, we want 8 from other time periods like the 50s and 60s, we want some from the South, rural, Hispanic, Black urban, Black rural, like one for each of these things, right? And he basically is like, this isn't the OEO, which is like the Office of Equal Opportunity, right? So he doesn't care about like how that these all have to be equal, but he just wants everything covered, right? So that it's just more of like it covers everything, right? And then below that, possible additional fairies. And there's some of the brainstorming on some of the ones that we actually have in the back of the book, like the geodesic gnomes, the calculus is down there. Um, that one to me was like super interesting because one of the things that I've worked on with that specific fairy is the letter E, which is Euler's constant, and that has some very interesting things going on with it that um, could tie into some of the stuff in the puzzles. So the letter E, it it approaches 2.718, and so when you think of like verse number, image number, how we match things up, verse 1 and image 8 would be Houston, verse 2 and image 7 would be New Orleans, and so it's 2.718, and those two puzzles seem to be like very connected, like the 982 train goes back and forth between them. I found a lot of things just because they're close on the map. I think like he just worked some things into those two puzzles that kind of overlap,
Mm-hmm.
and I think Jupiter and Saturn are some of the things that relate between those two puzzles, but there's just a lot of things. And when I saw E, like for um for New Orleans, like for me, pi is relevant. And then in Houston, I is relevant. And when you look at the one of the like one of the functions that comes out of that is like E pi I equals 1 plus 1 equals 0. It's just a formula, right? And all those letters that are useful in my theory were in this one theory about the letter E. And so I was just kind of like blown away, especially with like the how it approaches 2.718. Um, yeah, just like little things like that. You don't have to know anything about calculus or the letter E, what the log of E is, any of that stuff. All you have to do is basically be able to look at something and grasp like a really big overarching concept, like the numbers that it approaches are the painting and image numbers that go together.
I mean, and there, just to back up your idea, there's stuff on the ground that does the same thing, especially with Houston and New Orleans. Like there's a tree in New Orleans where John and I were digging back in the day, across from Gallery Hall, that was donated by Herman Park. And then I want to say that there was something matching from that park that was in Houston as well. Somebody told me that once, so don't hold me to it. But then like Houston and San Francisco with the Japanese pavilions, right? Like
Sure.
there's weird crap that ties these cities together.
Oh yeah,
And
it's like a spider web.
yeah. So that's just kind of adding on to that idea that people have.
Now,
It's just go ahead.
just so you
Sorry.
know, like I'm at Tranquility, I'm not at Herman Park,
Yeah.
but I think that everything at Herman Park is relevant at Tranquility. Like I think it's weird, but I've seen so many things at Herman Park that I'm like, wow, I think that's actually a hint for Tranquility. Like if you were there, like for example, he told Will House wouldn't be a waste of time to dig there. Well, I think
Yeah.
the reason that he told him that was because where he was digging could have been relevant to where it's at in Tranquility.
Okay.
That's just one of my theories that I have. But yeah, you mentioned like connections between San Francisco and Houston. So I'm at Tranquility, which was JFK sending us to the moon. And and JFK is obviously one of the considerations for the San Francisco puzzle. And there's 11 moons in the San Francisco painting, which could be referencing Apollo 11. So like I look at those kind of connections between puzzles. I mean, that's like my bread and butter. That's my wheelhouse.
I always like to ask one question. You don't have to answer this if you don't want to. Anytime someone brings up Tranquility Park,
Mm-hmm.
where the hell would you dig there? It's all concrete.
What's funny is so like I've been at that place for like the last couple of years,
Yeah.
and I have some people that I collaborate with, and we were searching in different areas within the park. We used to be at kind of in front of where the big three towers are that kind of look like the painting.
Yeah.
Um, it's not there. I can just tell you that it's not there. We switched to the other side of the park because of the line step across. And so if you're kind of at where the footprint is and you step across to the other side of the park, you end up over there. And there's some different things on that side that
All
are
right.
in fours, right? There's these spots over there that are in fours. There's the lights that are in fours, and so we've tried a bunch of different combinations. Um, and also, I mean, there's stuff in the back of the book for that area. The sophomore Jinx, for example, has his boot print looks like the small step monument that's at the park, stuff like that. So
Yeah.
um, I've kind of promised that I wouldn't talk too much about where we're at,
No, it's fine.
but
Yeah.
I
Don't.
mean,
Especially if you're
we
working
have
with a team. I don't want you to give it away.
we have looked around a little bit, on that side of the park. So
But I mean, there's so much in the back of the book that like relates to space and relates to history that I guess you can sort of put an overarching theme on it and just say Houston, but it does really fit with the Tranquility Park area, at least the theme of the Tranquility Park area.
here's kind of how I look at it. So let's say you were back in 1982 and you were just starting. You read the beginning of the book. It's a story about the how they got here, and then you get to the puzzles finally, right? The very first verse that you read is going to be the Houston verse, what we think is the Houston verse, right?
Mm,
What if that was like a template? It was essentially your set of instructions for how all the other puzzles work. So the very first line is Fortress North. Well, there's a thing called Fortress North America, which was used during like World War II and during the Cold War to basically signify a joint agreement between the United States and Canada that if they needed to, they would basically join forces to protect this side of the pond, right? So the very first line gives you the search area because we know that all the casts are buried in North America, right? In the United States and Canada. The next line gives you the Ayn Rand reference. So think about that. The very second line of the first poem is a literary reference. And we know how important now those references are throughout all the rest of the poems. They are, just sprinkled throughout. And the second line that he chose to leave us with is a literary reference. And it's a Russian one. So it almost puts you in a time period between World War II or the Cold War. Well, it's the Cold War then, right? And
okay.
then the third line, Friendship South. Okay, so now you go from this big macro view of the search area being Canada and the United States to now the friendship state is Texas and it's in the South. You have a star in the painting for the Lone Star State. It's the first thing that gives us an actual state, and it's coming in the verse and in the painting. So when you look at the other paintings that we know, like there are states in, like this would be essentially the template, right? We're giving you the search area, we're giving you a literary reference, and then we're getting into what state it is. So
Okay.
from there, like I just look at everything backwards because I think the back of the book is the most important. So when it says take your task to the number 982, I don't look at that as go to the 982 train. I look at that as the 982 train that you find in Houston will take you to the job goblin in the back of the book. And then that will take you to page 10 because the job goblin is also on page 10. So when it says the 982, you look at those numbers on the map page on page 10. The 9, I believe, is Cleveland. The 8 is New Orleans, and the 2 is New York. I might have those numbers off a little bit, but
I mean, I get where you're going.
like essentially, like what I think is it's telling you, it's almost giving you a confirmation that the paintings share the clues, which is right in front of the intro poem as you go into the paintings, right? So I think it's almost like a template that he's laying out for you in that first verse. Those like first 6, 7 lines are almost giving you the instructions for all the other ones. This is how you're supposed to do it. And then once you're past that, then you actually get into the solve, like where do you need to be? What instructions do you need to follow? And then you kind of go from there. That's just personally how I see the first verse working. It's like a template.
Okay. Kind of at a loss. I'm trying to process all of this now. I hear this and I think we've just made this puzzle immeasurably more difficult. Like,
Wouldn't that make it easier though? Like if you were given something that would guide you in the very first verse for all the rest of the verses,
I think
things
if
to
it was,
look for.
I think if it was direct, but like it's not direct. It's we're just making a lot of assumptions. If that makes sense. I'm not trying to say it's wrong. I'm just, my only comment listening to that is, wow, that's difficult. That's all I can come up with.
Wouldn't you say though that we've made assumptions about verse 1 based on the 3 that have been solved?
I mean, 100%.
Like we're
Yeah.
working backwards from those ones, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what if that's not it? What if that's not how it was intended to be done? What if it was intended to be done? Here's the very first verse. And if you understand how this verse works, it's going to help you in all the other ones.
All right. Okay.
That's just how I look at things.
Okay. I said I wouldn't have like a weird gotcha thing, but I do. It's
Good.
not bad though. I asked Chris Woodford if he wanted to come in too, because there were only 2 people that got early access to the manuscript, and that was you and Chris. You got the back and he got the front. And I figured if he wasn't busy and he could come in, we could sort of talk.
Yeah.
Because he really didn't look at the back. So I think like he has questions related to the changes that he saw on the front. And maybe you have questions really. I don't know. But I figured it was best to have both of you on. Like if we
That's
have
fine.
2 people that have dug through it. So, but he's going to come on a little later. Was
Yeah,
there,
I mean,
go ahead. I'm
go
sorry.
ahead.
Was there anything in the back of the book that surprised you? Like the manuscript?
There were some things that they originally had in there that they took out that I was like, oh, I wonder why they took that out. Like those things were kind of surprising because some of them were ideas that were used somewhere else.
Right.
And so I thought maybe like, did they just use it? Did they just remove it here because they decided to use it somewhere else? Which also then begs those questions of why. Like, why did they decide? Why is this term so important? I'll give you an example. They use Bacchus, which is one of the Roman gods, and or maybe it's the Greek god, but there's a Roman version, Dionysus, right? So,
Yeah.
like it's the fairy godfather, which became the Don Fawn. It originally was mentioned as the nomenclature for that, right? And then the bugbear is Bacchus Pacchus. And so they end up going with that one. And then they ended up changing the name of the fairy godfather to something else anyways. And then they gave him, a new sort of scientific name
Yeah.
for his nomenclature. And I just wonder if like stuff like that, like obviously Bacchus was important enough for them to put in the book. Like it wasn't just a play on words like backpack or, whatever. So like I just think of like, why did they reference this particular god? Like what's so important about that, right? There's other ones too, like Jupiter Pluvius is mentioned as one of the nomenclature for him, and that's Jupiter the Rainbringer, like Jupiter's in the New Orleans puzzle. Like there's a reference in the clock that leads to Jupiter. So like when I see those kind of things, it
What
it
is the
makes a
reference?
connection.
What is the reference in
So
the clock that leads to Jupiter? Because I know
so the
Mercury,
so the
but I
Roman numeral 4,
okay.
like if you look up why it's written a certain way, like I believe in the New Orleans painting, isn't it 4 1s? It's not IV, correct?
Oh God, I'd have to look.
Or am I getting it backwards? I forget.
We'll find out real quick. If my website ever loads, I should really work on making it load faster. Uh, it is IV.
It's IV.
Yep.
So like I can't remember exactly which way it worked, but the name Jupiter starts IV when you look at it, I think in Greece, in Greek language, in Greek
Okay.
numerals. So anyways, that's the beginning of Jupiter. And so normally I think they don't write it like that. Like it was one of the things that kind of stood out when I was doing my research is that they intentionally left that out because they didn't want to offend Jupiter, or it was the other way around. I forget. It's been a while since I researched it, but
That's
it
fine.
was either a nod to Jupiter or they didn't want to offend Jupiter. And honestly, I can't remember right now, but Jupiter was attached to the Roman numeral 4, specifically when dealing with a clock. So that's how it kind of got there.
Sorry, I'm watching the comments and there's someone named Ashley was like, that's right, it is 4 1s. And then she looked and she was like, oh shit, don't listen to me.
Yeah, I couldn't remember, but
That's what
regardless, like when you look at Jupiter, how it's spelled, like the
yeah.
I and the J are interchangeable in Greek letters. So
Yeah.
it's like IV is JU basically.
There's just like people trip up on stuff like this all the time and it's used as like gotcha moments in the comments, but when you're just talking about it, there's so much stuff in the secret that's hard to remember. Like
Yeah,
people are gonna slip up like that and you shouldn't hold it against them. It happens.
it's been too long since I researched all these puzzles, man. I've been at this for
Yeah.
like 3 years now, so I can't even remember the last time I looked that info up. So
I think what people, especially like new hunters, don't realize is once you get to a certain point in the secret, you're no longer looking at the puzzles, right? You're no longer really trying to solve the puzzles. You're looking at weird, obscure stuff that no one else is looking at, like
sure.
poring over a manuscript that might not have anything to do with the puzzle itself. So it strikes me as weird when people want to have comments or like people want to have conversations in the comments and they're like, I can't get any of the old guys to talk about Herman Park or whatever. It's like because we're off on some weird tangent somewhere.
Yeah, it's been that dead horse has been beat.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah, I hear you. So I don't know, like one of the things that interested me the most on that on page 93 that I brought up earlier was that date, right? So you can kind of look down all the names, and then when you go through the manuscript and start reading through the different fairies,
Mm-hmm.
you can see whether it was written before this or after this based on the name changes. So like on this list, the Mater Demon is already on there, right? But in the manuscript, it's obviously one of the first fairies that they did, because it was taboo dote, which is, play on words for table dote. And they eventually, like, it even mentions the Mater D as one of his buddies in there.
Mm-hmm.
But then they eventually just made a decision, like, we're going to go with this name versus that name
Well,
and just kind of move
isn't that the
forward with
Maitre
one.
Demon's scientific name in the book?
It is, right? It's the nomenclature that they went with. So that's when I ask questions like why. Okay, they changed the name of this fairy from taboo dote to mater demon, but it was important enough to still include in the nomenclature for that fairy.
Right, right.
So why, right?
Yeah.
And there's a fairy called the nomenclature. So if that's not getting you to think about, are these names underneath the name of the fairy important? Like you're just basically like at that point, you're just basically believing what you've been told. And I'm just not that kind of person. Like I'm going to question everything.
I don't
I'm
know
going to
that
ask why.
I don't know if anybody's ever said that the nomenclature wasn't important. Was the nomenclature in the book that this was a rip like a, I want to say rip off, but it wasn't. Was the do you know if the
Was it?
nomenclature was in the other book, the one that this was parodying?
I don't know. I don't have
Um,
it, so I'm not sure.
I got it somewhere.
But if you're like a strictly image and verse guy and you believe that the back of the book has nothing to offer, then you're going to be in the boat that the nomenclature has nothing to offer as well. I would imagine.
I don't know, because I'd consider myself a strictly the front of the book guy, but I would also say that even going back before the manuscript and all this stuff came out, there was parts of the back of the book that I always thought would be helpful in some way. I just didn't think we figured out how to use them. And the nomenclature was one of them, like the scientific names was one of the ways, and the other way was the description of the art, or the description of the photos, stuff that Byron would have a hand in. Because back then we always assumed the back of the book was just presented to Byron and that was it. There was no editing. But that was stuff that Byron could have a hand in adding to the back of the book. So I kind of always assumed that, like I said, those were important somehow, but we just didn't know how.
Sure.
I can't find my copy of the book wherever the hell it is, so I can't check. But I don't think it was. I don't think it was in there.
That particular fairy, like I've posted a lot, because I post most of my theories on Fair Peoples.
Mm-hmm.
Just in general, whether it's front of the book stuff, back of the book stuff, that's where I post most of my stuff. And I've posted a lot about that fairy because there's some really interesting things in that one. So just going off of that, the nomenclature for it, right? Taboo dote.
Yeah.
Like it's a play on word for table dote, and the opposite of that is a la carte. And back in the old days, like you had to order the chef what was on the chef's menu. You didn't have any choice, right? And then eventually a la carte came in, and you were able to order different foods off the menu. They had multiple items. Okay, the very first place that occurred in the United States was in New York at a restaurant called Delmonico's. It's a very famous New York restaurant. Okay, it also is famous for other things, like supposedly it is where chicken a la king originated, and that's mentioned in a different fairy. I believe that's in the Jackal lectern. And then in the Mater Demon, it also mentions a wine list as big as the family Bible. Well, that's also believed to be the first place that offered a wine list. And there's other things scattered throughout the book, which all seem to reference Delmonico's. Now, you again, when I find patterns, I ask why. Why would Delmonico's restaurant in New York be important? Well, who are some of the famous people that have eaten there? There was a huge party for Mark Twain. There was a huge party for Charles Dickens. So it's not giving you any answers that are tied necessarily to any of the puzzles. But if you are in the right spot at the right place, knowing what you're already looking at, and you see something like that, to me, that's a confirmation.
Okay. All right.
That's how I look at. That's how I use it, basically.
I can get behind confirmations, I guess, depending on depending on if they work with or against the puzzle. Because a lot of times I see people who use the back of the book and it works against the puzzle. Like people tend to pick out one word, right? Like they take a giant pole, giant step, and then they pick out the word giant, and they say this is the important word in this verse or in this line. And then they go to the back of the book and they find things that relate to giant, but they miss pole, step, right? So they miss 3/4 of the verse and they just discard it as this isn't important. And I guess that's always been a stickler for me when it comes to using the back of the book. As long as what you're using is helping you with the verse as a whole and not working against the verse as a whole, then by all means.
Yeah, and I don't always like I know Sean's been on and he's talked about using that. I don't always do that. In fact, I kind of don't. Like I didn't do that until I saw him talk about it,
Mm-hmm.
where he searches a certain word and then
Yeah.
tries to figure out, like, is this the right word? Because it might be used like 8 times in the back of the book. So how do you know which one, right? Um, I don't always look at things like that, but I have found, since he mentioned that, I have found some things that are kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's like one of them was it mentions the start talks, and they became the salt talks became the start talks, and so I was wondering if the only verse with salt in it is the St. Augustine one, right? And so I was like, what if where the line that it has salt in it, what if that's the start? Like, you're trying to figure out where in this verse do we start, right? And maybe that's like the really like to actually get to the place. Like, what if that's the really important one? And for me, that's like the salt run, right? So if the salt run's the start, then how does the important lines that actually get you somewhere, how does that work?
Yeah.
You know, if the first couple lines are getting you to the city, and a couple other things like the acrostic is getting you to the city, you know, how does it get you from a specific place to know where to look? Because I'm like I said, I'm not at the normal places. I'm not at the Fountain of Youth. You know, I'm at the amp. So for me, the salt
That's
run
not a
makes a lot of
normal place.
sense.
That's my place. Is that not normal?
You're not normal, man. Most people think it's at the Fountain of Youth. Come on.
That's true. Yeah. And well, I guess going back to the way Sean's looking at things, he's using sort of it's subjective of how he picks out the words, right? He reads the book and then he picks out a word and he says, I mean, this is a very obviously a very elementary way of explaining what he does, but he picks out the word and he's like, this word is used incorrectly in context. It's not, it doesn't seem to fit where it's put. So I'm going to focus on this word. And I guess like you can't do everything that we're doing with this puzzle is subjective. You have to, you're learning how words are used in context and you're learning what Byron is intending for words to be. And unless you've studied the entirety of the book and learned the whole of the context, you can't figure out if there's a word that's misused or that's out of place, right? And if you have studied the book and you can sort of figure out when words are used incorrectly or where they're used out of place, it could give you a hand in the verse maybe, but I guess that's dependent on whether or not how much Byron had a hand in the back of the book. So we're back to square one.
I think, like I said, like some of the stuff from the front of the book, I think is like almost like will take you to the place where it's at, like that direct. Yeah, I mentioned page 10, right? The map.
Mm-hmm.
Think about that page for a second. Like you're opening the book and you see a map and it has these things on it. It has the fairies' names,
Mm-hmm.
it has the numbers, and it has a bunch of lines on it. So when I see that, I think like, okay, why does it have a bunch of lines on it? Maybe we're supposed to draw a bunch of lines on the map. And that's what I've basically done on all of my solutions. I'm using points of interest that I find either in the verse or the image, and then drawing lines.
Yeah.
And where those lines intersect, or if they form like a corridor that gives you like a smaller search area, then that's how I kind of use things.
Mm-hmm.
And then I took that and I basically started doing it in the back of the book too, because there's a ton of places in there. Um, I know Sparks is famous for like saying, well, there's so many places in the back of the book. How can you know what they all mean? Like there's not cast there. Well, that's right. There's not cast there, but they can still help you by drawing a line on a map because you use that location somehow. And so that's typically what I do.
Yeah. That used to be a stickler for me when you would go like across states. It was like, how can you do
Well,
that?
it's
But
just a big map, and it
but
could get you to the town, right?
well, I mean, like, yeah, it could get you to the town. I think my only thing was when you were going down to like street level and like putting a dot on a corner, and then. But having said that, it's a common way to solve puzzles. You know, lines on a map
Yeah.
is a common way to solve puzzles. If you can make it work on an actual map, like my only stickler was you can't have that kind of precision going across the country, but you could have that kind of precision in a town map.
Yeah,
You
but
know?
even on so like one of the ones that I did, so downtown, right? I told you I was at Tranquility. Right
Yeah.
across the street is One Shell Plaza. And in my theory, that's relevant. But One Shell Plaza, the architect that built that also built One Shell Square in New Orleans.
Okay.
And I mentioned how those two cities are already connected, right? The 982 train ran between them, all that kind of stuff. Well, those things are basically like the downtown area. So if you had a large scale map of the United States, like you could put a dot on the map and you would be over it. It would be somewhere under that dot, right? And then
I see what you're saying.
if you drew a line from the downtown Houston through downtown New Orleans, guess what? It ends up in St. Augustine, the one verse that uses the word shell in it. Like those are the kind of things that I look at when I'm looking at like big picture stuff. It doesn't need to be that specific. I mean, I can zoom in on Google Earth and I can put it exactly where I want it. But if it was 1982 and I was using just a big map, it would still work. It would still get me to the same place.
Are we directly east of Houston? I didn't know that. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I get that. Now I'm
And
just
so
like,
I do that on a smaller scale too, with the things in the back of the book. I do it where,
yeah,
like the
okay,
post that I made today was one of
pretty
my
damn
theories that
close.
I used the San Francisco verse for New York to draw a line from the Stonewall Inn. And I use the address because it says at Stonewall's door. What's at the door? The address. And so I use
Okay,
that as a heading, and it happens to go through a Flatiron building that Mark Twain was very interested in.
okay.
So that's how I look at how puzzles interact, how verses can be used for different paintings, things like that.
Ashley wants to know if you factor in the litany in any way.
I think I'm not 100% sure on the litany. I think in a lot of ways that there could be one clue from each part of the litany that is super important for that puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not 100% on that because some of them I just can't figure out. Like, I don't have any working theory. But I mean, we've talked about Houston, so I'll give you this one, right? So the shadows on Houston, the sun would have to be on the left side of the painting, right?
Yeah,
If you were just looking at that from just a strictly like where's the sun setting, it's setting in the west, the shadows are being cast east. But when you look at the litany's talking about the sunrise. And so to me, what that tells me is you need to mirror the painting. You
okay.
need to either mirror it or you need to look at it from the backside so that you're looking at it backwards. Either way will work. Um, and that way the shadows go, to the west as the sun rises, which means that you're not looking north. It's not the North Star up there. It could be the Lone Star for Texas, but it would actually be to the south. And that's one of the reasons why I think that isn't the North Star. I think it's actually Jupiter. But that's getting pretty deep into some down the rabbit hole theory stuff. So,
And it's fine to go down the rabbit hole. Like I'm not like I'm not here to tell you you're right or wrong, you know? I'm just
but
I
why is real quick? Why is flipping the painting around so important? Because of the line perspective should not be lost. Like, I think that implies that you need to do something.
yeah.
Like, you need to do something to the perspective of the painting that changes it. And when you
Well,
do change it, it shouldn't, whatever the perspective that you need to see shouldn't be lost. So for me, that's mirroring the image, or just turn it over and look from the New Orleans picture through the painting, like backlight it, right? Either way, you're going to see the Houston image facing the other direction. And I don't think you're finding the spot in Houston until you do that.
see,
That's just what I think.
I look at that completely opposite from you. I read it at face value. It's the only painting with perspective. Perspective should not be lost. Do not change the perspective. Don't change it at all. Don't lose the perspective. I
That's
think
that's and see that's what's so fun about these, right?
yeah. I think like we were talking a long time ago about having a conversation like this because it almost feels like The Secret has a couple of different armies, right? It has armies of just the paintings and the verse people, and it has armies of the back of the book, and they clash. And I don't the two never sit down and have a conversation and understand where the other's coming from. And I think it's important to have that conversation. It's important to have this kind of conversation, just to understand where you're coming from, what method you're using, and put a little bit of reasoning behind the posts that people don't necessarily understand.
Sure. I think for how I approached everything, like I said, I got into it, and the first one I did was San Francisco, and I kind of looked at some things, and then the second one I tackled was New York, and I didn't look at anything. I just, where did this thing lead me? And I came up with a solution. And over time, like, I've never changed where I'm at in New York. Like, for over
Yeah.
3 years, I've been at Astoria Park for 3 years. And along the way, since I've been researching New York now, like, I could give you like a laundry list of things from either in the verse, in the painting, in the back of the book that all do the same similar type of things as far as pointing you to there with some of those mapping techniques that I've talked about. So, but there's other ones like that I've totally changed.
So there's
Montreal
one
I've changed, Milwaukee I've changed. I've changed a bunch of places. So
there's one thing that everybody in the comments is wanting you to do, which is, can you apply any of this to like Cleveland or Chicago or Boston? Like, does it work there? Because I know, like most hunters, they don't even look at those three, aside from
yeah,
surface level stuff, right?
yeah.
Um, is there it can this method be applied to those?
So like with Boston, there are references to, there's plenty of references to baseball in the back.
Yeah,
There's references to home. That home is actually mentioned a few times back there. Um, there is the one that to me was like the really eye-opening one, where it was like there were three references in a row that were actually like literary references or videos, like documentary type stuff at that time that I found. And it almost like I said, like there's no way you would connect those to the verse. But if you were in the right spot, like if you had figured out it's Pupilo Park, it's on this baseball diamond and it's at home plate, when you would have gone into each of those three and come out with like just reading them, just a basic cursory reading, you'd be like, wow, I think I figured this out.
yeah,
Because there's no way that those three things could all match up and line up as much as where you're at that point in the verse, using the verse and the image.
yeah.
So there's nothing that connects those clues, but it's almost like, wow, these match almost identically, the concepts at least.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily a stretch because, like we were saying before, home plate meant nothing until you were there, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of the problem I'm having right now with San Francisco. Like feel at home means nothing, right? You have to look in the painting to even have a chance at figuring out where to dig on that home plate. I mean, you're talking a 360-degree circle around it. Like, how do you know where to dig? Like, if you can't look in the painting with a single line from the verse that's that vague to tell you where to dig, it has to be in the painting. And that's how I feel about San Francisco. Like, giant pole, giant step, like, what does that actually mean? There has to be something in the painting, and you better have something at the site that you could then match up in the painting to help you, right? Like the way home plate did on the sleeve. And I feel like I have that, but then it's like you do your best to interpret what everything means, and it's like these haunting words from JJP where he's like, "Yeah, Byron says go right, and you're supposed to go left," and I'm sitting there thinking, "Man, I was on one side of this thing. Was I supposed to be on the other?" That sort
Yeah.
of stuff. So yeah, it's
So
frustrating.
when you work on this puzzle, do you not work on it in a linear sort of step by step way? A lot of people who, especially people who just focus on the verse and the painting, they're step by step. This line goes to this line, goes to this line, goes to this line. Do you work on it like that, or are you more of a all of these connections are in a bowl, and when you pour out the bowl, they make a pattern? Do you see what I'm saying? Like they all just
Yeah.
sort of fit together, and when they fit together, you found the correct solution.
I mean, I try to go in a step by step basis. I mean, I would say for easily over a year, I was doing it a certain way,
Mm-hmm.
and I was trying to figure out like why would this make sense? Like why would this be the solution? And you come up with something, and you're like, okay, everything works. But then, like the more you start to look at things, and the more you see the way the puzzles interact with each other, and you start to question, like, man, is that really like the best thing that fits, or is there something else that fits better? And I'm honestly of the opinion that for the most part, everything's out there. Like image matches people have found. Like I think it's all been put out there, and it's up to us to kind of like be able to synthesize it all together
Yeah.
and putting into something meaningful, right? And I'll just give you an example in New York. Like for me personally, if I read a New York solution and it doesn't have the center of her sash, meaning Roosevelt Island, and it doesn't have the image match that's next to her hip as the little symbol that's actually on the bridge and on the road as you go across the bridge. Like if that's not part of your solution, I just kind of just discard it because in my opinion, you're just not right. You're leaving out a major piece of the puzzle that is one of the most identifiable things that I think we've found in New York. And to me, I think for the most part, people just ignore it. They either don't know about it or they saw it and it didn't fit their idea, so they just discard it. And I've never discarded things when people have posted things that are like, wow, that is like one of the best matches I've seen. That those are the things that make me scrap my idea and start looking over there. And it happened at McGill when I've seen some of the image matches at McGill University in Montreal. It's happened, like I said, in New York with that, but I was kind of already there, so it just confirmed what I had already believed. But yeah, there's when I see something, uh, the guy that posted the image match at Tranquility the other day with the fountain and the moon hole behind it, like that's the image match that we've been using. So yeah,
There are people in the comments that don't know what you're talking about with the image matches in New York. Would you mind
yeah,
posting them later?
yeah, sure,
Cool.
yeah, no,
I
no
mean,
problem.
I feel like that's everybody does that, right? Like if somebody sends me a solution for something, if somebody sends me a solution for St. Augustine that doesn't involve like the city of St. Augustine, I discard it, right? Somebody
Yeah,
sends me something for, oh, I mean, not discard it, but like I guess I just don't put as much attention into it because it's like, well, you're wrong on a fundamental level, so can't hold that
I,
against you.
I you can't hold anything against somebody new who doesn't know.
Yeah,
Like if you're new to the hunt and something hasn't been posted in over a year, how are you going to know? Like you're trying to dig through. I mean, how much information is on our page now? It's
so
got to be
much.
pretty
Yeah,
deep, right? So, unless stuff gets rehashed, that's why every once in a while I'll throw something out there that I've posted before.
yeah.
Mainly just to get some new conversation going from some new people or whatever. But
I mean, Facebook's such a weird platform for something like this because the secret is it's a continuing conversation with new people constantly added all the time, right? It's not an archive. Facebook is not an archive of information. It's just that continual conversation. So shit's gonna come up all the time,
yeah,
over and over and over. Sorry, got a comment.
it's all good.
Anyway, I guess Chris isn't coming. I don't know. Let me check my
Well, we can
thing.
we can definitely talk about some of the stuff in the front, like because I went through everything, right? And I looked at things that were missing. I
So
looked at things that
I
weren't
don't
in
know
there,
how
but that were added later,
I don't know
that are kind of
it.
interesting.
I looked at the litany and I just had so much shit going on that I haven't had time to dig into any of this. The litany
Yeah.
was super interesting to me in the front of the book just because it's so different.
Yeah. I mean, it makes me think that they obviously didn't have the idea of like how important the birthstones were to the months and to the each puzzle with the flowers and everything, right? They didn't have that together yet.
Yeah, I
Like
guess.
they didn't come up with it really like hardcore until later.
I get.
I mean, some of those, I don't know.
It's weird. It really puts the puzzle into perspective when you look at stuff like that and when you look at the timeline and how crunched they were. Like if the litany is so integral that John Palancar in that last interview was like, "Oh yeah, that's integral to the puzzle," and it wasn't finished, it wasn't finalized a year and a half before the book was released. Like that doesn't give me high hopes for the puzzle as a whole.
Well, like I've said before, like on a lot of my posts, like I think it was well crafted. I think there are ways that you can self-confirm things,
Mm-hmm.
like even within the verses and like what you're supposed to do. If you do it right, I think that you'll find yourself in the right place.
Yeah.
Like Milwaukee for me is one of those things because like I'm not in Lake Park. I've already told you I'm not where people think it is, right? So
Yeah.
majority of people are in Lake Park. I'm downtown. And I think you start downtown and you go all the way to Lake Park, just like they showed on the EU episode. When you come out at the bottom of that washout, um, I just don't think they understand what "to the first young birch" means. Like, I don't think they get it. Um, for me, that's a line on the map. And there are other lines prior to that, like when you get to the top of the staircase and it tells you 200. If you draw a line at the top of the staircase that's 200 degrees on the heading,
Mm-hmm.
it takes you directly to the bottom of the washout underneath the bridge, right? When you go southeast over rock and soil. That 200-degree line goes right there. And
But
so there's little interesting things like when you look at, it mentions like after climbing the Grand, 200. Well, if Grand is 1,000 and then you're told 200, if you divide that into it, that's 5, right? Well, 5 lines later, that line that's 200 from the top of the staircase is exactly the line in the verse where you're at the bottom after going southeast over rock and soil. Like to me, that is a confirmation that you did it right. Like you
okay.
understand how that part of the verse works.
But and then to me that just goes back to what I was saying earlier, where people just pick little parts of the verse out and don't consider the verse as a whole, because the verse as a
Well, that's
whole
just
is instructions
sure it is.
in
And
Milwaukee.
I think Milwaukee is definitely one of the ones that's actually kind of like a step-by-step instruction.
Yeah.
I just think you return to where you started, which that's the whole point of To the First Young Birch. Like
Okay.
for me, that's the laureate statue. And it's also where you started your walk because of the Robert Frost poem. And so it's like a combination of the two. Like the first birch is the laureate because he was the founder that they dedicated that statue to. And
Okay.
then a young birch is the poem by Robert Frost, where it describes the life cycle of a birch tree.
Mm-hmm.
And when it's young, it's no bigger than a cane. And we have a cane in the image, right? The walking stick. So, like, I look at those kind of things and I'm like, okay, so what happens when I'm at the bottom of the washout and I run a line from there through the laureate? Where does it end up? Well, it ends up at the exact place where I started walking on my journey, like at the Mecca. So, and I'm on Wells again. I'm right back where I started. So, like, I look at that as like a self-confirming thing that number one, you started in the right place, but then also you came back to the right place because everything lined up exactly right.
Okay.
And then from there, you just follow the verse. And I end up at where Alan is, like at the Germania building right there at Postman Square. That's where I think it's at.
Paula Broussard asked a question, and I don't think it was directed at you, but it's a fun question that people ask a lot. So let's get your opinion on it.
Sure.
If so much, I think because we both agree, especially in the image, a lot of stuff has been figured out. Most of the image matches are pretty well confirmed. We kind of understand verses, we know cities, we know stuff like that. If so much of this has been figured out, why has nothing been found?
I think the hardest part is figuring out the end. Like being able to pinpoint exactly where you need to dig is very hard. I can't I can't sit up here and tell you how many holes have been dug in Houston, but it's a lot.
Yeah.
And we've had a lot of good ideas that didn't work. And each one of them could have been right because when you look at that verse, how are you going to figure out where to dig? Like, is it in the center of four alike? Is it something else? Is it a combination of two things where you need to like intersect some things? There's a lot of different interpretations that could be right. And that's why I think like we're good on the cities. I don't always agree with the parks for the most part, um, but actually figuring out where that little 6-inch thing is extremely difficult.
So I have a comment about that, but there was another question that I just want your opinion on. Isn't what you just said this a sign that this is a really bad puzzle?
I mean, there's got to be a way, right, that he can get you to pinpoint something. Like I would think if it's a well-made puzzle, there has to be ways that he put into the puzzles itself that will get you to the right spot.
Mm-hmm.
You look at the guys in Chicago and they dug a bunch of holes and they kept missing. And he tells them something to the effect of, you guys are in the right spot. I don't know why you haven't found it yet. Right. So he
Yeah.
gives them a picture. They even go and dig with the picture and they still almost miss it. You know, they are right next to it. So, I mean, I think maybe they didn't understand exactly how that end of the verse was supposed to work.
Mm-hmm.
You know, maybe there was a landmark that was missing, um, or maybe they just interpreted it wrong. You know, we've had a bunch of ideas on that, and it's like I wish I could know exactly how he intended it to work, but we just don't. You know,
Yeah.
we
I
kind
think
of
I
know
can
Cleveland.
I think I can answer all of those questions just going off of what you said there. Um, if we figured all this stuff out, why haven't they been found? If you look at the ones that were found, like it took the Chicago guys 6 months of digging. Like God only knows how many holes they dug there.
Yeah.
It took the Cleveland guys 8 hours of continual digging in a planter box that's no bigger than a twin size mattress. You know, it took Boston with an excavator. Like, I feel like the quantity and quality of holes that have been dug, the quality especially. Like if you think about how long it took each of those groups to find a cask, nobody ever spends that amount of time digging a hole. You can't unless you have permission. Like if you're just running into a park to dig a hole, there's no way you can dig a 3 foot hole 3 feet wide. It'll take you hours. You know, so you're clearing spots that you haven't even dug a good hole at. But like I use all of this as an illustration of, yeah, it's kind of a bad puzzle. Like if it's a 10-step puzzle and we've been stuck on step 8 for 20 years now, it's either because step 8 is immeasurably more difficult than step 7 was, or because it's bad. And I mean, just because the puzzle's bad doesn't mean like we can't have fun with it. But I feel like that's the biggest hindrance to us. There's not enough information.
Maybe it was just too hard. Like
Maybe.
would a puzzle being too hard make it a bad puzzle?
Yeah, it can. It
It
can
can,
make it a
right?
bad puzzle. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, JJP says there's something in the paintings that we're missing.
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm one of the few people that uses things to map. Like I think there are specific things that you can use to put on a map and then use another place, and then that'll help you go in the right direction, which is why I'm not in any of the parks that other people are. And so if I'm one of the few people that's in a different park and 90+% are in this other park, I mean, you're just chopping your odds down right there, right? Because everybody's looking in the wrong place. Because maybe we don't, as a community, we don't understand, like JJP said, everything the way the painting is supposed to work. Because I feel like the painting's supposed to get us to where we're supposed to be.
Yeah.
I think for the most part, the verse then takes you and helps you pinpoint the spot.
So you think the painting gets you to a broad area, and the painting pinpoint or the verse pinpoints
I
the
think it's
area.
like the macro, right? You start with the painting, it gets you to the city, for example, using the lat and longitude coordinates.
Mm-hmm.
Then it maybe gets you to an area of the city with some sort of a match, an image match, whatever. But that could also happen in the verse. It could.
Yeah.
Like the Saloy acrostic in St. Augustine could definitely get you to at least a smaller area of St. Augustine. But from there, do you travel? Some of these puzzles, I think maybe you travel more than we anticipate based on the first ones that were solved that you didn't have to go very far. Roanoke, it seems like you have to travel. I think Milwaukee, you have to travel all the way across the city and then back. And I kind of think the same in Roanoke. Because I end up back at the Wright Brothers Memorial. So, I mean, it's all kind of how you look at things. Um, but if a majority of our community isn't in the right place, then that's definitely going to affect our chances of finding it, right?
Yeah. I mean, I guess. I don't
Do,
know.
do you remember? Do you remember what you told me? Like when I was on the first time and we talked about the field guide. You remember you gave me a question
No.
at
It's
the end.
a long time ago.
Okay, so at the end, you said, "Hey, like everybody gets a question from me, right?"
Oh
And I
yeah,
asked
yeah,
you,
yeah.
you remember
Okay.
that? I asked you
Yes.
about New Orleans. I just wanted to know, like is New Orleans like there still? Like, is it findable?
Yeah.
And you kind of you made a comment to me roughly that was you basically said like New Orleans will never be found because no one will ever think to look there.
Yeah.
And I was like, I thought about that for so long because if you're at any of the parks, right, that people think it's in, like any of the common ones, that would have to mean that it's probably not there. Like if you would never think to look there, then any place that someone has kind of thought of, like for the most part as a common place, it wouldn't be there. And so
Yeah.
I started looking off the out of the way stuff. And when my mapping technique led me to a spot, that's when I switched to the place that I'm at now, which is
Yeah.
Huntersville.
I feel like that's a big hindrance that people are going into this puzzle with, is that we're assuming locations, right? We're assuming these are all public parks when they're not. They don't have to be, right? Like
Yep.
Montreal, I'm sure we'll argue it, but most likely not in a public park, you know, most likely on private land. Um, and when we go into these, like we're handicapping ourselves because cities only have so many parks. St. Augustine only had like 2 or 3 public parks back when this thing was buried. We're handicapping ourselves when we assume everything's in a public park, when it could just as easily, like, I've made fun of, there was somebody in Milwaukee that was digging in a planter box in front of the newspaper like 2 or 3 years ago, and
Mm-hmm.
we made fun of him on a podcast. We were like, ah, but it could just as easily be in that planter box in front of a newspaper as it could be in Lake Park, you know?
That was my first solution in Milwaukee. I was in like the street planter in front of the Schoenlieber building. There's
Yeah.
like 2 planters right there. That's where I was at, like in a planter box. Then they bricked it over. So I was like, well, it's either long gone now, or I better change my theory.
Yeah.
And I actually changed to a theory that I think I found evidence in the front of the book, which supports it really well, actually. So maybe that's something that we can talk about, because there was a theory that I had posted earlier on Fair Peoples a while ago
Mm-hmm.
that when I saw what they had done in the manuscript, I was kind of blown away because it almost helped support the idea that I had had
Okay.
about this one particular line. So it was
Go
just
for it.
super interesting to me.
If you want to talk about it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so this kind of gets back to what we were talking about with Sean, right? Looking for keywords.
Mm-hmm.
And when it's going into the beginning of it, it's talking about like after it talked about the first 3 explorers that went, right? And then each group started to go. Like it mentions how the um the Spanish went like later, right? Or they had
Okay.
already went, but it was mentioned with a different group. And it always just like stood out to me like that doesn't make any sense. Like why would they, again, asking the question, why would they say this group went with this other group when they could have just mentioned it before?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so when I went through the manuscript, they actually did mention it before. I was like blown away. I was like, wow, they mentioned it before, but then they intentionally moved that line to later, like a paragraph later. And it blew me away because of what I had kind of posted about that. Um, so first of all, we'll go for like what's in the book. On page 13, it says the French were first to follow. And then in parentheses, the tall, proud Haddis of Spain had already departed, however reluctantly, with their diminutive domestic relatives, the duendes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So why are they mentioning these Spanish fairies when we're already on to the French fairies? Like, why was it so important to mention them with this particular one? One of the things that I picked up on was the way they split the line in the book. It says with their diminutive domes, because there's a dash as the word goes to the next line. And so diminutive domes to me stood out
Mm-hmm.
as like, what if that's a description of a place? And because we're talking about the tall, proud Haddis, and in the Milwaukee verse, we have proud, tall fifth. So for me, that is the Germania building, and it's the lions on the Germania building. If you go and look at the Germania building, up on the top of it, there's these big domes, kind of like onion domes, but right next to them, there are these super tiny domes. They're these little diminutive domes. And I was like blown away that, like, what if they hid this phrase in there and they wrote it in such a way so that it would hyphenate right there. So you would just get diminutive domes. And I posted all about this, like I said, on Fair People. Well, if you look at the manuscript, it's actually on the page before, like when they're actually talking about the Spanish fairies. And so they intentionally moved that line, and then they added some words to it. So you could argue that they had to add words to make it fit the way they wanted to, so that it would hyphenate at this particular location when they did the final copy. And so that was just one of the things that, like, when you have a theory and you get something that kind of jumps out at you like that, it kind of blew me away. So
It's
that
not
was one of the things.
it's not out of the realm of possibility because like just like in the front of the book, there's Fountain of Youth, there's Fairyland, there's all kinds of different
Right.
locations that's called out very blatantly in the front of the book.
Sure.
So
Yeah, the other one that they didn't change anything about it, but Ruddy Alf is Eric the Red. He's a Viking, right? And for the most part, we think if you think you're starting in downtown Milwaukee and you're going past the Leif Erikson statue on your way to Lake Park, you're going to go by that statue, right? Well, Eric the Red's name is on that statue, and it mentions that he left a boot print on the shores there and then returned to harp on it. Well, there's a harp on the Pabst Theater. So when I look at things like, okay, we're given two locations right there. We're given Eric the Red, which we have on a statue, and we're given a harp, which we have on the Pabst Theater. And when he says he returned to harp on it, well, just run a line returning towards where you started, which was downtown somewhere, right? That line goes directly to Postman Square. Like it's like a straight shot. And so when I see stuff like that, like I think those are built in hidden ways that you could basically shortcut something because the fairies left you a clue right in the front.
Somebody had a question for me. I gotta scroll back up though. Well, it was basic. Oh, in one of the interviews with JJP, it sort of seemed like he confirmed the lions and the juggler painting. Do you think that's what he intended? Yes, it's 100% what he intended. Those
See, I don't have a problem with
those
that
specific
because,
lines.
oh yeah, and I don't have a problem with that because I think it's the lion. It's just on the Germania building.
Yeah,
Like I don't think it's
you
the
just
one
think
at
it's
Lake Park.
lion. Yeah,
I just
okay,
think it's a lion. Yeah,
it makes sense. Like there's a lot of things that John, like if I'm playing devil's advocate here, it's very possible John could have gotten a Polaroid of a lion. He painted a lion, and he knows that's supposed to be a lion, but he doesn't exactly know which lion.
good.
You know,
And he wouldn't be lying to Josh Gates if he said that you're closer than you've ever been, because he
I
was in the
mean,
right city at least.
okay.
If you want to play devil's advocate, right?
Well, I don't know that I would go that far, but I mean, like, I don't know. Lake Park's got so many good things going for it.
It has
It's
a
hard.
lot.
It's hard for me to get away from Lake Park. But then again, like maybe I'm just I don't have a cask, so what the hell do I know? You know?
Like I said, like I mean, I would guess that there's probably, I don't know, 90% of people believe it's there.
Yeah,
I would say most people, right?
90 or more. There's been so many holes dug in that park, which makes it even more difficult. I mean, we go back
Yeah.
to quality of holes, but still, like that place has been torn to shreds and nobody's found anything.
Any decent theory has probably been dug, right?
Yeah, and it in Lake Park, it's all 2 to 3 different theories, right? In Lake Park, everybody has basically the exact same theory that ends at one of 3 places, somewhere down under the ravine, at one of those stupid lions, or at the Walcott. That's basically it, as far as theories for Lake Park, and nobody's found anything. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
The problem with where we think it is at Postman Square is they like covered it up with field turf.
Yeah,
So we can't even dig there,
it's becoming a problem everywhere.
Yeah.
Field turf and paver stones.
Yeah.
I mean, we definitely have to rethink how we work this puzzle. I think you and I are on 2 separate ends of a spectrum on how we should rethink things or how deeply we should rethink things. But I think we can both agree that we're missing something. And without conversations like this, we'll never figure out what it is. Like 2 people standing on 2 sides of a field just yelling at each other that the other side's wrong, that accomplishes nothing.
Sure.
We've got to figure out what we're missing in order to progress.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why, like I mentioned earlier, like there are image matches that have been found. Like this community is really good about finding things and posting things.
Yeah.
Like there's not a lot of secrets being kept, I don't think. I think for the most part, people are putting stuff out there that they find, right? If they find it interesting, maybe they're not in that city, so they're just going to post it, right? Maybe somebody can do something with it. And there's a collection of information out there that I think if you sift through it, you just have to be able to almost synthesize it together into something that makes logical sense enough that, hey, maybe this is right, you know? Um, yeah, I don't know. Like I said, like I think it's a lion, but I'm not at Lake Park. I'm at a different lion. So, maybe it is something important like that. You're just looking at it the wrong way.
So let me ask you a polarizing question. It's going to be
Okay.
fun. Um, all of the stuff that's come out this year, between the Palancar interview, the gift giver crap, the manuscript, the paintings, all of this stuff, you think it's helping or hurting?
I don't know. Like, think of it this way, right? The NFL has some kind of a guy get in trouble and it's publicity, right? Maybe not the NFL. Maybe that's not the best idea example, but there's something that is a little bit smaller in scale than the NFL, but they get something controversial in the news, and the next thing you know, everybody's talking about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even bad publicity can be good
Oh
because it's
yeah,
generating interest, right?
I'm
Just
100%
within,
on that team.
so like whether or not everyone agrees with everything that's come out, at the very least, it's giving us things to talk about, and it
Yeah,
is giving us information. Like even if we don't agree on everything or what everything might mean, how we're supposed to interpret it, all that kind of stuff. Like I still think it's creating conversation and maybe just creating buzz and more interest, especially with people that, like you said, might have almost just been like they're standing pat, right? They've already researched every potential place. They're kind of set in their ways. Maybe something new comes out and it reinvigorates them. You know what I mean?
yeah. Ashley Kohler said it's hard to give complete faith when Ben Asen claims to be a better friend than Gift Giver, and Byron Preiss wouldn't tell him where these are buried. Number one, Ben doesn't know who Gift Giver is. And number two, Ben has no reason to know where the cities are. And Ben hasn't called. So if Ben's so worried about it, give me a call. I'll tell him who it is. I don't care. They won't care. It's Ben, for God's sakes. People, a lot of people are asking if you're on Discord.
Me?
Yeah,
No.
you should probably get on Discord. You'd have some really good conversations with some people on Discord.
Yeah. More real time.
Yeah, it's 100% real time. But I think there's a lot of people who sort of gravitate towards your way of thinking on the puzzles on Discord, and it's way like the conflicts on Facebook, they don't happen on Discord. Like there's a couple of people who are dicks, but they've reined it in. And with Discord you only get one shot. You can't make a new account. If you get banned from Discord for being an ass, that's it. You're gone forever.
Yeah.
So Discord's really mellow and like everybody really works together. But the alternate, there's channels for alternate cities, channels for alternate views, channels for all of this kind of stuff, and a lot of people are sort of in line with your way of thinking there. I think you'd be welcome if you ever decide to give Discord a shot.
Like I said, I mean, I post most of my stuff on Fair People's just because there's not a lot of activity over there, and it was opened as a place to post about the back of the book specifically,
Yeah,
and so that's where I put most of my theories about that kind of stuff. I've been around here long enough to have gone through some of the people that have been banned from this group, and they used to give me a really hard time, especially when I was first starting to post back of the book stuff back then. So I just kind of was like, well, for the most part, I'll just let this be the channel that focuses on verse image type stuff, and I'll just post all my other stuff over on Fair People's. Like
and,
honestly, I just want a record of it, because I
yeah.
forget ideas. It's nice to be able to go back and look at things that I've posted before. So
Well, the thing about Fair People too, like it's smaller. When you get into 13,000 people, like conversations are difficult, and it's really just people yelling at each other. That's why I like Discord, because it's a continual conversation. You can ask questions and have the questions answered directly. But Fair People, like if you want, we'll post the link. I don't know if you want a link to Fair People posted.
it's all good. I mean, for the most part, we just want people believe that the back of the book is relevant. So we just, if you don't believe that, then it's probably not the place for you. So
Hi, Chris. You're muted.
I know I didn't want background noise coming in, interrupting the conversation.
I don't know if you've heard any of what we've been talking about. We've had a
Only
really
the
good
last like 2
conversation, though.
minutes.
That's nice.
I'm gonna have to rewatch it.
So Carly
tomorrow.
basically said that the manuscript has changed his way of view on the puzzle completely, and he no longer believes anything in the back of the book is correct or helpful in any way, and that he thinks that you are the new king of the secret and all of your ideas are great. Carly, that's basically what you said, right?
oh yeah, 100%.
Carly,
No,
it's good to see you in person for the first
Yeah, you
time. I
too,
don't
Chris.
think we've been
I
on.
I didn't know
Carly's
Carly
one of the
was-
first person I remember interacting with, like when I got into the secret.
Yeah. That's the thing that, like, something that I've always respected about Carly is no matter if you agree with him or not, he will have a conversation with you. And most of the time, unless you are just a direct asshole, he's respectful about it. Like it's like I said about Alan, about Anagram Guy. Like it doesn't matter if you disagree. You just want to have that conversation, you know?
I love debating people. Like to me, that's part of the fun. Back in the day when, I don't know, Adam was around here, like that wasn't very fun.
I mean, he's still around. Don't kid yourself.
Yeah.
I just don't read the YouTube comments anymore.
Exactly.
I learned my lesson.
I don't know, man. I was even a dick to you, Carly, and I think I was just so stuck in my ways. But then I realized, like, and I think it was Chris and Phil and John that made me realize it. Like, we really are missing something. It's not just we're not digging in the right holes. We're not digging at the right spot. And that kind of made me rethink everything. I still don't know how much I buy about the back of the book, but it doesn't matter whether I buy it or not. That conversation is what's important.
Sure. It's not for everybody.
Back of the book's a spectrum, I think. Like, people like to make things true or false, black or white, right or wrong, back of the book or no back of the book, right? But like in the spectrum, from the back of the book is integral and required to solve the puzzle, to like towards the middle, like the back of the book can be confirmational or have things that like let you know when you've got something, all the way to the back of the book is not relevant to it at all. Like, I think there is a spectrum there that can be taken into account. It doesn't have to be one extreme or the other. Like at the 982 train or the 82 train being in there alone like tells us that it's somewhere on the spectrum.
There's something there. You just got to figure out what that something is and how to apply it.
Whether the question always then is like whether it's like this starting point, like you need to take something from the back of the book and apply it, versus figuring something out in the verse or the painting or whatever and seeing it echoed in the back of the book, and like how that flow works, I think is.
There were two polarizing questions that I asked Carly. I already know your answer to one of them, and so does everybody else, so I'm going to skip it. But I want to ask the second one to you, Chris. All of the stuff that's come out this year, from the manuscript to the gift giver stuff to the painting or whatever, has it been good or bad?
How general are we gonna like?
It's just the question,
to...
man. You can answer it however you want to answer it.
I think
for the community, for the secret.
For the secret, I think it's good, because if nothing else, it's just more data points to show us. Well, the manuscript shows us the evolution of the puzzle, that it wasn't just Byron had this like moment of genius and decided like, here's the thing. It's actually, it was changed and it was tweaked, dark turned to light, stuff happened. Like, just being able to get into his head a little bit more. A lot of times these ad hominem arguments are so frustrated because people are like, well, Byron would have never done that. And I'm like, how do you know that Byron would have never done that? So now we're maybe I don't want to say we're there, but like we can see the changes he made, and we can say like Byron did make this change. So I think that is good. I think the gift giver is good because, well, the first gift giver post was good because it was like, wow, we are really missing something here. If this is accurate and if it's true and we believe what we're being given, there's obviously stuff that we're glossing over or not getting into. But for the community as a whole, I think it's also caused a lot more confusion, a lot more wild, like explosions of ideas.
Yeah.
And perhaps for as good as it's been to show us what we're missing, it's also what's the word I'm trying to think of, like spread it out more. People are going way all over the map instead of trying to hone in on things that are similar and work together. People are just like out on the fringes with their pet theories.
Here's a good question for both of you, I guess starting with Carly. Do you think people focus on the cities too much? Like, do you think, because so many people argue about like correct cities or correct whatevers, do you think that argument, like trying to prove that broad part of this puzzle, do you think people focus on that too much instead of focusing on the smaller parts of the puzzle, like how to interpret X or how to interpret Y? Do you see what I'm saying? Like steps that have been taken long ago.
Yeah.
Do you think we argue over those too much?
I mean, there's always going to be people that are willing to look at things with their own point of view and kind of go through that process that happened a long time ago. And maybe they end up at the same place, maybe they don't. But regardless, I don't see anything bad in that. And honestly, I think that there's some macro level stuff going on in some of these puzzles that is relevant, even though it might not be in the right city. So I'll give you an example with Houston. The large column in the front looks like Reunion Tower. And it was probably done, I would guess, as a little bit of a challenge, right? A little bit of a red herring. If you were trying to figure out, is it Houston or Dallas? And there's even stuff in the field guide that kind of throws those two cities up against each other within the text. And so if you're looking at that and you're thinking, man, this is Reunion Tower, it's in Dallas, but then all of a sudden you see that Houston Street runs right next to Reunion Tower. And then you find the latitude and longitude numbers in the painting. And so you're almost like, okay, sort of like how the Cleveland painting had a Liberty Bell in it for Liberty Street, right? Maybe this is supposed to be Reunion Tower, but you're supposed to get out of it Houston Street so that you go to the town of Houston.
Right.
So it almost just confirms things. Now I've gone like way down the Reunion Tower rabbit hole. I've looked at things that it was in, like the TV show Dallas. Like I think there's a scene in that where like they're filming at the top of that, and what they're talking about in that scene, I believe, is very relevant for the Houston puzzle. Go out there and watch it if you can. If you can find that episode on like Prime or something like that, go watch the episode that they filmed at the top of Reunion Tower, and tell me if something. Light me up in the comments. Let me know if you find something in that scene that you think could be relevant to the Houston puzzle, because I definitely found something. There was also a movie that I found that to me seemed very, very kind of relevant, called the Lathe of God, or the Lathe of Heaven, actually, where they use that as part of their thing. But yeah, anytime I find something like that that's like a pop culture tie-in, I always go down that rabbit hole to see where it leads.
But can't we, everything that was just said, can't we squash it by saying Byron sent out an email that said there was a cats buried in Houston?
They could.
So
But
what's
there
the
still
point of
could be a
having?
clue. There still
What's
could
the,
be a clue with the Reunion Tower in Dallas that's relevant though. Like
okay.
that's the same thing I'm talking about with the back of the book stuff. It's like tangential, right? It's off to the side, but it still has meaning for what we're doing over here.
Right. But that's more of like that's more of a smaller intimate clue of the puzzle and not one of the more broad things like what cities are correct.
I mean, personally, like I'm good with the latitude and longitude numbers. I'm good with the
Yeah.
rebus in Milwaukee being the reason that they didn't use it because it's really close to the Chicago numbers. Like I'm good with all the sort of rational thinking on all those things. What interests me the most is like with the latitude and longitude numbers, why are some of them mirrored? Like if they're mirrored, maybe we need to mirror the painting. Like if the rebus is backward in Milwaukee, maybe we need to mirror that painting to figure out some small part of it.
Yeah.
Maybe not the whole thing, but at least something of it, you know?
I got you.
Because Charleston has one of the numbers is mirrored. So maybe we're supposed to mirror something. And one of those pieces in the Charleston puzzle might be you might only figure it out once you mirror the image.
And maybe those things are like John was saying, where sometimes you have to use mirrors. Maybe that's telling you the portion of the painting that needs to be mirrored. Or somewhere around here you need to mirror something or look for something that's mirrored.
Because Houston has one too. The one ironically, it's the one that got chopped off. You know, we didn't see that number until we got that picture of the painting, right? And then we saw that I think it's the 29 is all the way off on the edge of the painting and it got chopped in the book. You don't see the whole number, but it is mirrored. And like I told you earlier, right? The litany talks about the dawn. And if you're going to get those shadows to go in the correct direction, you have to mirror the painting to get that. So,
Okay. I think I know Chris's answer to whether or not we should be arguing about the cities.
I think we should not be arguing about the cities.
So
yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of space, right? And it takes a lot of it's like arguing about the cities is the distraction, I guess, is like the biggest statement I can make about it. It keeps people arguing and not like focused and working on stuff. But
yeah, that's probably the best way I could hear anybody explain it.
I don't really get involved with those threads anymore. Like I'll just skip them.
Yeah, it's like, what's the point?
Yeah, if people want to argue about it, that's fine. And I'm not going to tell anybody that they can't look in a city that isn't one of the ones that we think. Like, do your thing. Like, you want to look somewhere else, look somewhere else.
Yeah,
I mean, it doesn't mean anything to me and what I'm doing.
So Chris, something that I asked Carly earlier. Is there anything in the because I told everybody that Carly was given access to the manuscript a little early. You were as well. Is there any changes in the manuscript that just outright surprised you, besides the litany? Because we went over the litany and everything about that's surprising.
The biggest change for me is the change from the dark ones to the shining ones. And I don't think that's solely in the litany. I think it's in that front of the book passages as well. It was something that I'd never really considered very much until like I saw the litany and I was like, a lot of blood and a lot of like what's he getting at here? And then as I read the beginning part, it was like, the dark ones came. Poor quoting because I don't have it in front of me, but then in the actual version that we have, it's the shining ones came. So something changed. I don't know what it is or what it's relevant to, but at some point he needed to change from dark to light for some reason. So that's been my point of pondering lately is why and how could that be relevant, and if so, to what extent?
I mean, it changes the whole tone of the front of the book. Yeah. Everything. It's crazy. Maybe Byron was just having a bad day.
I noted
horror book.
I wrote that in my notes actually, Chris. like when I went through line by line, I noted things that were different, and the dark ones were changed to the sweet spirits in that first little section on the passage to the New World. And in fact, the passage to the New World used to be the passing of the elves. So just from that alone, you know that this was written after the changes to the litany happened, because the elves were part of the litany originally, and there were supposed to be 13, and then when the elves were removed and they became the makers of the casks, then that's when he went with the passing of the elves, right? They were the ones coming over bringing these casks with the gems, I would assume, right? That was kind of the idea, but that was eventually changed to the passage to the New World. But yeah, the shining ones, there's two things that I've found that are kind of interesting little tie-ins. They're kind of rabbit hole stuff. One is in the Pilgrim's Progress, which is an old book. It is referenced in the Pilgrim, and the angels in there are referred to as the shining ones. And then also in Stephen King, like The Shining, like if you ever read that book, the shine is essentially special abilities, right? Like you have these mental powers that are known as the shine. And so you would be a shining one if you had the ability to move things with your mind, like telekinesis, or any of those things that those characters in those books had. So I kind of wonder if he was hinting at some Stephen King stuff there, because I have like this, like Stand is in the Charleston verse. Like I've looked into the Stand as a potential tie-in with that line. Like there's a lot of interesting little, like I said, pop culture references that I don't think as a community we've really investigated enough, because there could be some strange tie-in things.
It's gonna go on the next list of questions to ask JJP. It's like, was Byron? I have like a serious list. Like adding, like, was he a fan of Stephen King? Was he a fan of the New York Times crossword? Like these are the kind of things that if we could learn about his interests, like we know he loved the Beach Boys, right? That I believe that is like mostly a fact that we know, right?
Yeah.
Other
And
than
Oingo Boingo, apparently.
Oingo Boingo were awesome. That was Danny Elfman.
Yeah,
Like,
Danny Elfman is God.
Oh yeah. Where was I was going somewhere with that. So in the Charleston verse, what is it? The cool, clear sound of water, or song of water. There's like a Beach Boys song that's like something cool, cool water.
Yeah.
And I always want that to be a thing, but I've never actually been able to find a rock solid Beach Boys reference beyond that, like anywhere in the puzzle. So it's like, okay, did he
I have
put
one.
things? Okay, I'm right. Good.
I have one from the field guide.
Yeah.
I'd have to look up which fairy it is, because I get these two mixed up. I think it's either the Phantasmaglory. Let me see. Hold on. I can find it real quick.
Because that's the thing. Like if we can find proof that he put hints or references to something that he loved in there, then we can start to extrapolate. We can use like inductive logic and say, if he did it with this, might do it with this. I think the Wizard of Oz falls into that category. There's some, I should say, potential Oz references that he's maybe kind of baked in. Whether they're Easter eggs or they're puzzle related is up for grabs. But
I found it. The Myra Chimera has this line where it's like, to a foxy East Coast lady, she might appear as a magazine cover; to a West Coast starlet as a poster; to a Midwest woman as a catalog picture, et cetera, right? So foxy East, exactly,
girls, yeah.
exactly. Foxy East Coast lady. You have foxy lady, which is Jimmy, right? Jimi Hendrix. And then the East Coast girls, and then the West Coast girls, and the Midwest farmer's daughter, right? All those words, just those words all together, make me think about that song. And so what's left out, right? Like that's what I always think, like, okay, he mentioned these things, are the things that they're singing about with those particular lines important, or is it the one they left out? And so those are the kind of questions I ask myself all the time when I find these little references. And it could be something, it might not, it could also not be, right? But like, that's the way my mind works.
Yeah.
I naturally make connections like that.
And I think like it's so, because we know nothing about Byron's intentions, we can make those connections to, you know.
I'll give you another example, right? So in the Tinkerbells, there is this line where it says, while a burnt out terminal case with a headset somewhere squats over a black box full of buttons with the apocalypse on hold. That's an Apocalypse Now reference. Like if you've seen that movie, you know, the guy in charge has gone crazy. And he's sitting there on his little black box, which is this recorder, right? And he's broadcasting, and he's just rambling on all these crazy thoughts that he has. And the kind of play on words with it is that the Tinkerbell is putting the apocalypse on hold, right? So it's not happening now, it's on hold. And so that's how you get to the idea of apocalypse now, because apocalypse is capitalized, but then she's putting it on hold. So it's not happening now. She's messing with things, right? Because that's what the fairies do. They mess with people. And so that's a reference to a very specific scene in the movie. And what's really interesting is, having watched that movie, it has like that really famous scene where they're coming in, they're going to attack that village, and they're playing the Flight of the Valkyries, which I know you guys have talked about the Ring on here. That's straight from Wagner. You know, it's one of the songs. It's like one of the most famous songs from that. So it could have just been a way to get you to think about that again, because there's multiple references to Wagner as well. And so when I'm looking for patterns, those are the kind of things I'm looking for. A couple references to Wagner here, and then this reference over here gets you to the same thing.
I'm wondering if we could do what Chris said, but sort of in reverse. Instead of like focusing on what Byron's interests were and what Byron would put in, because we don't have that much about Byron, we just don't know. We got a shitload from Sean and Ted, right? We've got volumes of magazines with Sean and Ted's work in it, where we can see exactly how they reference pop culture in ways unrelated to A Secret, exactly the kind of things they would reference, exactly how they would use their words. So we could take examples of their work and apply it to The Secret, not to add to the puzzle, but to take away random information. Like this is the way Sean and Ted illustrate X. So we know probably not part of the puzzle. We can take this part out. I mean, because that was their job. That's what I always fall back on when people bring up pop culture references. Like that was their job, to parody pop culture, and that's what they were good at.
But there still has to be a meaning, right? Like you have to have an idea of, like, so the example I just gave you, what is so important about putting an Apocalypse Now reference hidden in this piece of text?
But maybe it's not important. Maybe it's just that's their writing. That, I mean, it's the back of the book is a satire. You have to be satiring something, and not everything that you're satiring has to be important to the puzzle.
I mean, it is a very specific reference, right? Like I get all the satire that isn't specific, where it's just talking about general random things.
Yeah.
But this is like a very specific reference, you know?
Well,
and so to me, that's what I research.
I go back to, like, I don't remember if this was your post. I think it was, because I think we talked about, I actually think we talked about it on a podcast episode, but I can't remember. It was a specific reference to Nagahide, right?
Yes.
Nagahide's not a word that's used now, but back in the 80s, it was a word that was used. Yeah, Nagahide. Sure. I don't remember the ad, but whatever ad it was, it's made of Nagahide. Like,
well, the Naga was a fairy too. Like that was part of their branding. This little Naga was a creature that they used, and it was a little fairy.
Yeah, but just because they used that reference to Nagahide, while it's obscure now, it wasn't obscure then. Does that necessarily make it a clue, or is it just, you know, they're writing satire? They got to satire something.
Sure, I can tell you specifically with that word, because I've researched Nagahide, and I know who invented it, right? And his name's Hunter. And so I could go through probably 10 different examples from things I've researched in the back that all tie into the word hunter somehow. And so that's the way I look for patterns, right?
Okay.
And that's one of the ways that I kind of do that.
Okay. I don't know. I feel like it's weird because we're talking about stuff we'll never know the answer to, right? It's all like
not?
it's all like methods used to get, you know, a non-answer. Could we do this? Could we do that? We'll never know.
Yeah. But I
there,
can tell you that there's a very specific theory that's been put out there that will lead to Orion the Hunter in the New Orleans painting. So I just look for combinations like that. Like this is possibly confirming that
yeah.
because I found 10 instances of this word being important.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, like, that's kind of all you can do with the puzzle, right? You got to like shake it and see how many of X do you have in the X bucket, how many of Y do you have in the Y bucket, and then do they overlap? And if you have all these disparate things that at some point start to overlap, then that's probably as close as confirmation as we're gonna get with this thing.
It goes back to the whole framework, right? Since we don't have a framework, anything's possible. You get hunts like Masquerade, where it's 20 or whatever pages long, and it's very clear what's part of the puzzle and what's not, and it's easy to work on. And you get stuff like Whistle Pig or The Secret. It's 250 pages long. You have no idea what's part of a puzzle and what's, you know, part of a book. I mean, a book's got to reference shit. A book's got to have a story. Not everything in that story is going to be a clue. What's a clue? What's not? It makes it almost impossible.
But I can tell you just from reading it, when there's references to like reading between the lines, and there's references to man not believing in fairies.
Yeah.
And like I talked to you at the beginning about like this mythology that they created, you know, like, you know, there's references to Tinkerbell and Peter Pan and the author. There's references in the Bugbear to him being upset because they cut down so many trees to write about stories that had nothing to do with them believing in fairies. Like that's why he left. So
yeah,
like I see things over and over again, like these concepts. Use your imagination is another concept that is littered throughout the references in the book. So if you're not using your imagination, if you're thinking like total, like the wrong side of your brain, right? Left brain, right brain.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're on the logic side, you're not using any imagination and creativity. Like I think you're like, you got to be at least 50-50. You got to go down the middle somewhere, you know?
I don't disagree. I just like Chris is saying, you've got to shake the tree to see what falls out, right? You've got to, when you have this much information, you almost have to follow all of the information just to see if it leads somewhere. It's a tedious process. Speaking of tedious processes, did you say you have a list of the changes from the manuscript to the book? And if so, would you be willing to share that with people? That would make a lot of work much easier.
I mean, I went through, it's about 12 pages. And I mean, I could make a PDF out of this. Yeah, no problem. I mean, it's just going to be like really short.
Yeah, just
truncated
words.
thoughts, you know, like, hey, they changed this, that, or whatever, you know? So, I mean, it's not going to be anything too groundbreaking. I think it would be a starting point for somebody as they were working their way through the manuscript to look at, say like, okay, he changed this section. And then what did he change it from? What did he change it to? You know, why did they remove this? Like this, like if a section was removed that was just very bland and didn't contain anything, and then all of a sudden they rewrote it, and all of a sudden there's these very specific references. Like I would be like, man, I'm going to research those. Like that could be super important. And then on the same hand, like he could have taken stuff out that looked very specific and replaced it with something. And you're like, well, why did he do that? Like, was that an idea that didn't work? And I don't know. Well, the reason, at least be a place for people to start.
The reason I was asking was on 12 Treasures, there's two ideas that we had, both for the new wiki that Chris and I and everybody's working on, and for 12 Treasures. On 12 Treasures, I wanted to put the pages of the manuscript with the pages of the actual book, and then list what changed between the two. And we wanted to do the same on the wiki, and that would just make the job 1,000 times easier. If we could look, you know, where to have an idea of where to look at a glance.
Yeah, some of the things I wrote were kind of general, right? Like he did a bunch of general edits on this page. And so I don't go into specifics because it's kind of obvious that he was just cleaning up either poor writing or
So many
wanted to
spelling
express the
mistakes.
idea a
Yeah.
different way, whatever. But then there's other things where it's like, man, they obviously wrote this section that's in the book later, and it must have been really important for them to put it in there. Like, why were these specific references put in there?
Mhm.
Those are the kind of things that really intrigue me.
Keep getting I keep getting messages about drama. Apparently there's drama going on somewhere. Fun. Always
In the
drama.
comments or
No,
in
somewhere
general?
else. In general. It's always drama.
Always drama.
Maybe you should have like a siren go off or something, you know, like
Every time there's
But never
drama,
turn off.
my life, yeah.
just like a
Phil-
breaking drama.
Phil Abbott popped in and said, "Holy shit, it's Carly in the flesh."
I'm here, man.
Just get Phil to come in. Screw it.
Like, I'll give an example of something that was removed that just caught my eye. So it mentions Mab is the fairy queen, right? And it mentions her like in the passage to the New World. But it also, in the manuscript, it mentioned Oberon and Titania, which those are the fairy king and queen as well, but they were given different names at different times. So, like Shakespeare in A Midsummer Night's Dream has Titania and Oberon as the fairy king and queen. But then in Romeo and Juliet, it's Queen Mab. And so it's a redundancy to list them all in the manuscript because it's maybe he felt like I'm jumbling the waters too much, or I'm maybe giving too much away, like with multiple references that could lead back to Shakespeare, for example. Maybe he felt like he was giving too much away. So he pulled the Oberon and Titania references. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
just went with the Queen Mab.
Yeah, that's interesting because I always took that reference to be Edmund Spenser, but I wouldn't, I didn't take it to Shakespeare. But now hearing you say that, I was like, maybe he was trying to hide the overt Shakespeare-ness, and maybe I've been looking down the wrong literary reference.
Well, and Spencer is mentioned as well. Like whatever Spencer was mentioned, it got removed as well. So that begs the question: was it removed because they were hiding Spencer? Are we supposed to focus on Shakespeare? I don't know. Like, yeah, I don't know. These are questions that I don't have the answer to. You know,
Like this, we're bringing people together.
where's the Spencer? Let me find the Spencer reference. What he did. Okay, so that was on. So if you're following along at home, page 20, and that was part of the filthy hobbit, right? So he changed the entire history on that fairy. Like if you go through and look at it, like the entire history was swapped out. And so part of that was the mention of Edmund Spenser, and he had the epic poem that you're referring to, right? The Fairy Queen.
Yeah, the Fairy Queen.
And the thought is that Elizabeth I, it was an allegory for her, right? It's referencing her, and there's this whole tie-in with Sir Walter Raleigh, who was sent by her. That was the establishment of the Lost Colony and all the history that goes along with that. So, like, did he feel like he was giving too much away by removing that reference? Like he was like, man, I got to hide that because that's almost a direct connection in the field guide to take you to the Lost Colony.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
There was something that I was talking about before because we were talking about that anniversary hunt that me and Arthur did, right? It's coming out in like a week. And I was saying that Arthur didn't know how I did anything in the verse, and I didn't know how Arthur did anything in the painting. And like I looked at his painting and I can't figure anything out. And I was saying, because you're so segmented like that, you tend to think to yourself when you're making part of a puzzle, what if this other person that's making this other part, puts in an error and makes something too easy? And therefore, if he does that, I have to make my part even more obscure. Right. And I wonder if instead of being a bad puzzle, that's where a lot of the difficulty comes in from The Secret. With Byron and John and Sean and Ted and Joel and Ben, with them all working remotely without email or without internet. All they can do is have phone calls and send faxes of Polaroids or whatever. If Byron would think maybe John's going to do something over here that's going to screw up and make things too easy, so I'm going to make my puzzle harder. Where at the same time, John's thinking maybe Byron's going to do something over here that's going to make it too easy, so I'm going to make my puzzle harder, and it just gets infinitely more hard. It gets it gets harder by being more obscure, right? Kind of like what you guys were talking about.
Yeah.
We know the literary references are obscure.
Yeah, very obscure for the most part.
Some of them so obscure that like I even question that I'm like seeing it. Like,
yeah, like Cold as
Last
Glass.
of the Mohicans one.
Well, like Cold as Glass is, you could use that phrase for anything. Like, is it actually a reference? Is it not? Probably is, but
you have to be either really well read,
yeah,
or you have to be from the future and have the internet. Right?
Okay, so like I have thoughts specifically on that because I've had that same question before a lot. And okay, Carly, I know you're really into the Houston verse.
Can I ask this? I've always assumed that was from Atlas Shrugged. Is it from Anthem?
No, it's from Anthem.
Okay, they're both basically the same book.
I mean,
philosophical level.
Ayn Rand's entire series is all trash, so they're all the same because they're
just
all
be
trash.
Dicks to each other and everything will be fine.
No, but do you want to talk about that specific reference? Because
sure,
I have thoughts. So I've been going down this like Americana thing with The Secret. I think I talked about it in one of the last times we talked, like references to the Pledge of Allegiance and finding other like of these like specifically like Americana references.
Right.
So one thing that I was playing with was trying to figure out in the Houston verse, like how the hell would you find that reference if you weren't if you weren't totally familiar with the book, like you're never really going to get there. I have to bring up my post because I'm gonna butcher this because I made a blog post about this at some not too far away time.
You guys are still making blogs? I haven't checked that website in forever.
We off and on, you go through phases.
Is it still thesecretofthesecret.com?
Yes.
Okay.
So sort of taking those first 6 lines together, right? Like Fortress North, Cold as Glass, Friendship South, take your task to the number 982, right? So like, let's say that those 6 lines are a direction that are like an instruction, I should say instruction, that are telling you how to get to something called the number 982, whatever that may be. So abridging a lot of text. Those 2 words at the beginning, Fortress North, you kind of like come into that. No, there's like no context, but with this sort of like Americana freedom, liberty vibe in front, thinking to somehow that got me thinking of the stars. I was thinking of the Star Spangled Banner, right? Like I have this land of the free and the home of the brave, like in my mind. And I looked it up, and the Star Spangled Banner used to be, or was originally titled The Defense of Fort Henry, which is like some fort in Baltimore that it was like important in the, I don't know, y'all are the Americans, you know your history, I assume.
We were also educated in America. I don't know if you're aware.
So the thing about if Fortress North, if we can say for a second that Fortress North is this important American fort in Baltimore, that the Star Spangled Banner is named after. Star Spangled Banner is also the national anthem. So would that get you from this fort to the national anthem, which is the word anthem, the book anthem?
That was a lot of big steps.
I know, but
I mean,
getting to the book anthem can get you to Cold as Glass, which we know is a passage about trains, right? So like if we're talking about these like continual steps, these are huge leaps, I should say, but if you can go from one to the next to the you've all of a sudden gotten your way to train, does that then take you the next step to say like the number 982 thing is a train?
Yeah. See, my way of thinking of it doesn't help you at all. It doesn't help you in the least. I look at it the same as I look at the quote in the New Orleans verse. That quote is obscure, but if you know it, you all of a sudden know what city you're supposed to be in, right? The half of the puzzle is completely taken away from you. And in the same way in Houston, unless you know all of the information we know now, 982 is one of the hardest lines in this. I mean, it can only apply to one specific thing, which is not historical, and you will not know about it unless you're standing in front of it. And Cold as Glass could help you know what that is if you know the reference. And if you don't know the reference, you're just kind of screwed.
But you'd already have to know Houston.
Yeah.
So like the question there would be like, did we solve the painting and get Houston out of it? Or is Friendship South itself just a reference to Texas's motto? Like, does Cold as Glass get you train? Friendship South tells you Texas. So the number 92 is a train in Texas, and the painting gives you Houston, and you interlock it all together.
You know what I would love to do one day is to get three people with alternating opinions, somebody like Carly and Chris, together and just pick a city and just be like, get me somewhere from the very beginning. Forget everything you know. Forget latitude and longitude coordinates. Forget the fact that we know this city. Use this book to get me there. Right? I mean, you could use latitude and longitude coordinates if you want. They're pretty integral. But
yeah.
But I feel like it'd be a fun exercise to go through all the shit that people see that, number one, get us to a city, but then break down how to get to that specific part, to sort of go over what we take for granted, you know, and see if we can find different ways to interpret it. Maybe that's how we can hit on something we've missed. I don't know.
Spend a lot of time trying to like leave the assumptions at the door and like look at it fresh. It's hard.
Yeah, you can't. You almost can't.
I tried doing that with the I put up a litany page on the wiki, and I was like, okay, I'm going to look at this puzzle not knowing anything. What's the first thing that I see? It's like, this is each hunt is about a jewel. We often refer to each hunt by a city, or we refer to each hunt by a month, but those are not the first things you're presented with. If you come to this book sight unseen, the first thing you're presented with is the hunt for the pearl, right? It's like you're looking for 12 treasures. What are the treasures? Pearl, diamond, garnet, like whatever. Like those are the things, right? That was like one sort of mind shift change that I had from referring to the paintings by the month, like thinking of the painting and the verse pair as this is for the pearl. And how does that change my thinking about, you know, how the painting or the verse can be interpreted?
Yeah, but even then, even when you're trying to forget everything, you still know the goal. You still know where you want to get. Like there's always something that's going to skew your logic. There's always something that's going to skew your research, or, you know, the rabbit holes that you go down, because you at least know where you want to end up in a general sense. Um so yeah, I don't know. You end up being like the people who are like, it's in Paducah because here's an outline of the thing, because you're working, you know, you're working backwards. It's impossible to forget everything that you know. I don't know.
Chris, you'll need to go back and watch the beginning, because I did talk about those same exact 6 lines in the Houston verse.
Awesome.
So you can maybe let me know how you think about what I said, because I do kind of touch along the same sort of lines of like maybe these are instructions. I kind of think it might be a template, but I go into the Cold as Glass and Rand anthem deeper than most people. Like I'm just not going to be surface level and think about it like, yeah, it's describing a tunnel with a train track in it. I'm going to go further. I'm going to say like what was the most important theme that came from this book, and them finding the letter I again, right? It's about individualism, and it's this small word that was removed, and everybody was given a number. And so the letter I to me is like super important. The column in the painting looks like a capital, or it looks like a lowercase I.
Okay.
The fountain that was posted the other day, that's the location that I'm generally at. It looks like an I, like a lowercase I. It's an upside down exclamation point, which is at the end of the line. There's the spout. And I talked about how like you could maybe flip the image. Well, what if you flip the exclamation point upside down? Other things that I've thought about with that is, you know, anthem would be basically telling you it's a flag. Like there needs to be a flag somewhere that you're using to tie in.
Mm-hmm.
There are ones at Tranquility that I believe are relevant, you know. So and even going, I mean, you can get pretty deep when you start really diving into the themes of some of these literary references. Like even Ayn Rand, she wrote Anthem, but it didn't get published first. She wrote The Fountainhead, and then The Fountainhead got published, which then led to her getting Anthem published. So is The Fountain then relevant? The Fountainhead? Because I kind of think The Fountainhead there is relevant. So, you know, it all, to me, like it's this path that you go down, and I don't stop superficially. I tend to dive pretty deep.
I just
You
keep
mean
thinking of how much I like Ayn Rand's books, except for the message. Like Anthem was such a good book, man. It had like, except for the part where you have to be an asshole to everybody else.
yeah,
Such a
no,
good book.
objectivism is not for me.
No.
I'm not gonna speak highly of that. But I do the one thing that initially jumped out at me is the flag. And like I kind of like I'm finding these like flaggy references in more than one verse. Like we all, you know, the San Francisco verse, the injustice for all. Like it's he's tweaked it, but he's clearly getting us in the mindset of um, the one that you say about the flag. What's it called? Uh,
The national anthem,
no, it's the
or the
other
Pledge of
one.
Allegiance.
The Pledge of Allegiance, that one, right? The
Yeah,
with liberty and justice for all. But he changed
yeah,
liberty to education.
yeah.
In truth be free, but he's still getting you in that mindset, right? Like there's something about something about flags, or the flag, or specifically the United States flag, that he wouldn't be using those words in that way if it wasn't important.
Do you think there's a piece of the flag in the Houston painting hidden up in the leaves? Have you ever thought that?
No, I haven't. I've never.
I mean,
No.
there's a small section that to me looks like just the bars of the American flag. It's super small. It's not like something that would stand out.
Where at in the painting? I'm curious.
It's hidden in the leaves, so it'd be kind of up to the right, I believe, kind of near where the 30 is, I think, if I remember right.
It's where it has the sort of lines going across like a void. Is that what you're talking about?
Kind of horizontal, maybe
Yeah.
3 or 4 together.
I know what
It
you're
might
talking
not be even straight across. It might be more like angled.
Yeah.
It's been a while since I looked at it, but
Yeah, no, I as soon as you described it, I was like, oh, that part. Okay. Yeah. All right. Just curious. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm into that stuff. Definitely.
and I'm also into things like that. Like you think of the letter I, but then you have the symbol, like the I, right? Whether that's something from one of these, Masonic Templar drawings that we've seen that look like Houston. There's all kinds of stuff that you can get into with some of these connections with like wordplay and some of these other things that you just don't know how deep they went with some of these things.
Yeah, that is truly the problem. It's like, how deep did Byron go? How deep would Byron go? These are the questions we'll never really know.
All right. Well, we've been going a while. Are you guys ready to wrap, or is there something else you guys wanted to talk about? Because I know Carly, I invited you specifically to talk about the back of the book. Are there points that you wanted to make that we missed, or that we just glossed over?
I don't think so. I'll put out my notes like in a PDF. If anybody wants to look through them, they can. Like there's just little things that, like I said, they made changes. Either something was taken out and something new was put in there, or it was never there in the first place and then it was added for the book. So is that important? Some of them, I don't know, like I mentioned earlier, like I was at Milwaukee, I was at the Germania building, right? And Germania is the personification of Germany. And so one of the things that I found really interesting when it was going through the German part, it mentioned how it was the fatherland in the manuscript, and then it was in the book it got changed and it became a she. And so the personification of Germania is actually female. And so for them to change it from the fatherland to she, like there had to been a reason for that. Maybe it was just that they got it wrong and they realized it. But at the same time, like I want to say there's 4 or 5 different representations of personification of different countries in the book. There's Britons, there's the United States, there's Germany's, there's like 4 or 5 of them that I've found. And I have a feeling that it's relevant in that Milwaukee puzzle at the Germania building. And her personification used to be on the building, like she used to be up there, but they removed it when World War II was going on. So
Chris, is there anything from the back of the book you wanted to hit on?
No, I just came to hang out and shoot the shit with y'all.
Well, thank you. It's always fun to come and hang out and shoot the shit. I think Cole's doing a thing with Montreal with you soon. That's going to be fun. If you guys can ever get it scheduled.
Yeah, scheduling is hard. I need to schedule it 8 to 10 on Sunday. It's like seriously the only time I ever like have some free time.
I'll put down a Sunday Fun Day if I can get that done for you. We'll cancel all of Sunday Fun Day. We'll give it to somebody in the group. I'll teach somebody how to stream. I'll give them my whole setup. Just stream Sunday Fun Day. I gotta go do Montreal with Chris and Rebecca and Cole. All right, well, cool. Then we'll end, I guess. It's been going on a while anyway. All right, so cool. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Thank you.